Inches. Not miles. Not kilometers. Not the vast, unbridgeable distance that mainstream media is describing this morning as the reason the Islamabad talks fell apart. Inches. That single word, chosen with absolute precision by Iran's Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi, is the most important word in global diplomacy right now. And if you want to understand what actually happened in that Islamabad hotel, you need to understand exactly what Araghchi meant when he used it. This is not a man who speaks loosely. Araghchi has spent decades sitting across negotiating tables from American diplomats, in Vienna, in Geneva, in Muscat, in every diplomatic capital where the Iran nuclear question has been debated for the past 20 years. He knows what diplomatic language means. He knows what it signals, what it costs, and what it reveals. When he says the talks were inches away from a memorandum of understanding before they collapsed, he is not using a figure of speech. He is giving you a forensic description of what happened in those final hours. His exact words: when just inches away from an Islamabad memorandum of understanding, we encountered maximalism, shifting goalposts, and blockade. 3 words. Maximalism. Shifting goalposts. Blockade. Each one a separate accusation. Each one pointing at a specific American action in those final hours. And the question that every serious analyst must be asking this morning, the question that almost nobody in the mainstream press is properly confronting, is not simply why the talks failed. We know they failed. Vice President Vance is on Air Force 2. The Islamabad hotel is empty. No American negotiators remain in Pakistan. The real question is what specifically happened in those final hours to turn inches into collapse. What was the goalpost that moved? What was the maximalist demand that Iran could not accept? And why did America announce a blockade of the Strait of Hormuz before the diplomatic process had even formally concluded? Because the answers to those questions do not just explain what happened in Islamabad. They explain everything about what happens next. Whether the blockade is a negotiating pressure tactic or the opening move of something far more dangerous. Whether China's planned weapons deliveries change the entire strategic equation. Whether Pakistan can find a new formula. Whether there is any realistic pathway back to the table before the ceasefire breaks down entirely. That is what we are going to work through right now, inside those 21 hours, inside the nuclear breakdown, inside the American miscalculation, and inside the choices that will determine what the next 48 hours bring. What the 21 hours actually produced. Before we focus on what failed, we need to be precise about what the Islamabad talks actually achieved, because the picture that emerges from both sides is of genuinely substantial progress before the collapse. Trump himself posted on Truth Social during the negotiations that most points had been agreed to. Not some points. Not a few points. Most. Iran's foreign ministry spokesperson confirmed the same picture from the other side, stating that discussions covered the Strait of Hormuz, the nuclear issue, war reparations, the lifting of sanctions, and a complete end to the war, and that talks were intensive, uninterrupted, and went deep into each issue. So what specifically was moving toward agreement? On sanctions relief, both sides appear to have made real progress. The structure of a phased sanctions reduction tied to Iranian compliance with verification measures was discussed in genuine detail. Iran's central bank governor was physically in the room to work through the financial mechanics of sanctions relief. The fact that he participated extensively tells you that both sides were seriously engaging with the economic architecture of a potential deal, not just trading talking points. On the Strait of Hormuz, progress was also made, not on full Iranian sovereignty over the waterway, which America could never publicly accept, but on a framework for coordinated passage. Under this framework, Iran would receive transit fees within internationally recognized limits, and American warships would transit the strait without requiring an Iranian Revolutionary Guard escort. The specific operational mechanics of a reopened strait appear to have been substantially worked through. On war reparations, the issue most politically toxic for the American side, progress came through creative reframing. Rather than direct American payments to Iran, which Trump could never sell domestically, the compensation package was being structured as a combination of Gulf Sovereign Wealth Fund contributions, IMF program access, and the phased release of frozen Iranian assets. Both sides could describe the same financial arrangement in entirely different terms to their respective domestic audiences. That kind of diplomatic creativity, where the same deal means different things depending on who is explaining it at home, is actually the hallmark of serious, sophisticated negotiation. Most points agreed to. And then they hit the nuclear question. Where the inches were, and where they disappeared. The nuclear breakdown is the heart of this story, and it requires careful unpacking because the gap between the two sides was genuinely narrow, and then it was made wider. Trump was direct in his Truth Social post. The only point that really mattered, nuclear, was not agreed. Vance confirmed it at his press conference with language that deserves close attention. America, he said, needs to see an affirmative commitment that Iran will not seek a nuclear weapon and will not seek the tools that would enable it to quickly achieve one. That phrase, will not seek the tools that would enable quickly achieving a nuclear weapon, goes significantly beyond a simple commitment not to build a bomb. It is a demand that Iran surrender its enrichment capability, the centrifuges, the enriched uranium stockpile, the entire technical infrastructure that could theoretically be converted to weapons use. In other words, America was not just asking Iran to promise not to build a weapon. America was asking Iran to give up the ability to build one. Araghchi's position, maintained consistently before, during, and after the talks, was clear. Iran will discuss limits on enrichment levels. Iran will discuss expanded verification mechanisms. Iran will accept deeper IAEA access. Iran has repeatedly stated it never sought a nuclear weapon and that its enrichment program has always been for peaceful civilian purposes. But Iran will not surrender the right to enrich uranium itself. That right is not simply a technical or diplomatic position. It is embedded in Iran's national identity. It was established through decades of struggle, defended through 2 wars, and it represents, in the Iranian political imagination, a symbol of technological sovereignty and national achievement. For any Iranian leader to sign away enrichment rights is to invite the accusation of having betrayed the nation. The domestic political consequences would not merely be severe. They would be existential for whoever put their name to such an agreement. So where, precisely, were the inches? They were in the specific wording of the nuclear commitment, not in whether Iran would make a commitment, but in exactly what that commitment would say. Both sides apparently agreed that Iran would make some form of nuclear pledge. The gap was in how that pledge would be worded and what it would actually mean. America wanted language that effectively ended Iran's enrichment program, framed as a voluntary Iranian decision rather than a forced capitulation. Language that Trump could hold up before the American public and say, Iran has committed to never building a nuclear weapon, and we have the verification architecture to prove it. Iran wanted language that explicitly preserved its right to peaceful nuclear energy, including enrichment for that purpose, while committing to never weaponize. Language that Supreme Leader Khamenei could present to the Iranian parliament and say, we gave up nothing. We reaffirmed our rights. We simply stated publicly what we have always said, that we are not building a bomb. Inches between language that America could call denuclearization and language that Iran could call sovereignty preserved. And in those final hours, according to Araghchi, America moved the goalpost. The shifting goalposts, what actually happened? This is the accusation that cuts deepest, because it speaks not just to what America demanded but to how America negotiated, and it explains why Iran's delegation left Islamabad with deep mistrust rather than cautious optimism. Sources familiar with the talks, as reported by American media, indicate that Vance arrived in Islamabad having been given firm guidelines by Trump. America's position was described as the final and best offer. There would be no further flexibility. The Iranian side needed to understand the realities on the ground. But the Iranian delegation experienced something entirely different. Based on what Araghchi said publicly and what Iranian sources reported from inside the room, they experienced a negotiation in which the American position kept evolving. Points that appeared to be converging toward agreement were suddenly reframed. Nuclear language that seemed within reach in one session was replaced by more demanding formulations in the next. The floor kept moving. Araghchi's 3-word sequence, maximalism, shifting goalposts, blockade, describes a specific progression of events, not a general complaint. First, the goalposts shifted. The nuclear language that Iran believed it could accept was replaced with language it could not. Second, rather than searching for the minimum formulation that both sides could live with, America pushed for the maximum it wanted. Third, and this is the action that may have been the most destructive of all, America announced the blockade of the Strait of Hormuz while the talks were still technically ongoing, as Vance was preparing to leave, before the diplomatic process had formally concluded. That sequencing sent an unmistakable signal to Iran's delegation. America was not leaving space for Pakistan to facilitate further engagement. America was not waiting to see whether additional sessions might bridge the remaining gap. America was announcing consequences before the diplomacy had run its full course. The blockade announcement, in that context, was not just a policy decision. It was a message. The talks are over because we have decided they are over. America's perspective, and where it falls short. The American side of this story is equally important and equally incomplete. A senior American official, speaking to the press after the collapse, offered a revealing assessment. Vance came away from Islamabad with the conclusion that Iran had fundamentally misperceived its own negotiating strength. That the Iranian delegation arrived with assumptions about their leverage that did not reflect the military realities on the ground. From Washington's vantage point, this assessment has a certain cold logic. Iran's air defenses have been 80% destroyed. Its petrochemical export revenues are down 85%. Its nuclear facilities are buried under rubble. Its economy is in severe crisis. Its supreme leader was assassinated. Iran came to Islamabad needing a deal far more urgently than America did. Given all of that, from America's perspective, Iran should be making concessions, not holding firm on enrichment rights. The final offer America put on the table was, in Washington's view, generous given the military facts. Iran's refusal was not a principled sovereign stance. It was a miscalculation by a delegation that had not fully processed what the war had done to their country. But here is where America's analysis misses something that is not a diplomatic detail. It is a structural reality. Iran's domestic political constraints are not a negotiating position that can be pressured away. They are a hard limit of the Iranian political system. Iran's leadership cannot give up enrichment rights and remain in power. Iran's parliament cannot be presented with language that its hardliners will call surrender. Araghchi cannot sign a document that will be described, the moment he lands in Tehran, as a betrayal of national sovereignty. America is correct that Iran needs this deal more desperately than America does in pure economic terms. But America is wrong, profoundly wrong, if it believes that economic desperation automatically translates into political freedom to make concessions. Iran's negotiators did not arrive in Islamabad as free agents. They arrived as representatives of a political system with hard internal limits that exist entirely independently of how badly Iran's economy is suffering. No amount of military pressure, and no amount of economic devastation, changes those internal political limits in the short term. The inches that separated a deal from collapse were not just a language problem. They were a gap between what America believes Iran can agree to and what Iran's political system actually allows any Iranian leader to agree to. What comes next? The cliff edge. The blockade announcement is the most immediate and dangerous pressure point. America has declared it will blockade ships entering and leaving the Strait of Hormuz. Iran has called the Strait a red line. Iranian and American naval forces are currently operating in the same narrow, high-tension waterway. The potential for a confrontation, accidental or deliberate, that triggers a resumption of full military operations is higher right now than at any point since the ceasefire began on February 28. Pakistan is urgently calling on both sides to maintain the ceasefire. Foreign Minister Dar has stated it is imperative that all parties continue to uphold their commitments. Pakistan has pledged to continue facilitating dialogue. But the American delegation has already left. Vance has said Iran must now decide whether to accept the final offer that remains on the table. In Washington's framing, the ball is entirely in Iran's court. Meanwhile, China is planning weapons deliveries, specifically air defense systems designed to rebuild the capabilities that American strikes destroyed. Trump has warned of serious consequences for Beijing. But China, which has continued purchasing Iranian oil throughout this war and has a direct strategic interest in constraining American military dominance in the region, may calculate that the long-term benefit of rearming Iran outweighs whatever economic pressure Washington applies. If Chinese weapons begin arriving and Iranian air defenses start being reconstructed, America faces a binary choice: accept a Middle East in which Iran is being progressively rearmed by China, or resume strikes before those new defenses become operational. That choice, accept or strike, is the cliff edge. The next 48 hours are moving toward. Then there is Russia. Putin's offer to mediate, made within hours of the Islamabad collapse, is not an act of goodwill. It is a strategic move. Russia is offering to step into the space Pakistan occupied, to become the next facilitator, to host or organize the next round of talks. And Russia has something Pakistan does not: a direct, deep relationship with Iran's Revolutionary Guard, the institution that ultimately controls Iran's nuclear program. Russia has been embedded in Iran's nuclear infrastructure at Bushehr for decades. If any outside power understands the technical parameters and internal politics of Iran's enrichment program well enough to help find nuclear language that both Washington and Tehran could accept, it is Moscow. But Russia as mediator is not a neutral actor. Russia benefits economically when the Strait of Hormuz is closed and global oil prices rise. Russia has its own complex interests with America over Ukraine. Russia would use any mediation process to advance Russian strategic objectives, and the resulting deal, if it ever materialized, would carry the fingerprints of Russian interests alongside American and Iranian ones. The world that has emerged from the Islamabad failure is no longer a simple bilateral confrontation between America and Iran. It is a multidimensional global contest, China arming Iran, Russia offering mediation, Pakistan urging ceasefire maintenance, America announcing a blockade. The inches that separated peace from collapse in that Islamabad hotel have opened into something that looks very much larger. The weight of inches. Inches. Araghchi said it. Inches away from a memorandum of understanding. Inches away from a document that could have paused, not solved, but paused, the most dangerous confrontation in the modern Middle East. And then maximalism. And then shifting goalposts. And then a blockade announced before the talks had formally concluded. The history of failed diplomacy is full of moments exactly like this one. Oslo. Camp David. The 2015 Iran deal dismantled during Trump's first term. The February negotiations destroyed by the very war they were designed to prevent. A deal within reach, the language almost there, both sides having moved closer than anyone thought possible, and then something in the final hours. A demand too far. A concession too politically dangerous. A domestic calculation that overrode the diplomatic logic. After every one of those failures, the world faced the same question it faces this morning. Was the failure final, or was it the prelude to a new attempt, wiser, more realistic, stripped of the maximalism that turned inches into collapse? The answer is not yet known. It will be determined by whether America's blockade forces Iran back to the table or pushes this war to its most dangerous moment yet. By whether China delivers weapons or holds back. By whether Pakistan or Russia can find the formula that 21 hours in Islamabad could not produce. Inches away. And then everything changed. The world is watching what happens next.